Clerk, do we have a quorum? All right. As I mentioned earlier, we have two issues or two things to consider this morning in our meeting. The first is to add a clause in our bylaws to indicate that electronic meetings are authorized through the use of electronic technologies, by means of which all persons participating in the meeting can engage orally in interactive dialogue and discussion. That's a kind of a fancy way of saying we can do remote meetings via Zoom and vote in that manner if necessary. This does come from committee, and so it does not need a second. Are there any questions or any discussion? If you do have things that you would like to share at any point during this meeting, there's a microphone up here sitting next to the ridiculously good-looking Craig Levere. And so, look at it, his is about as red as his shirt right now. But you can use this microphone here. Are there any questions or any discussion?
Are you just jealous because I've got hair?
He just asked if I was jealous because he had hair. Nobody asked you. So that's why we don't give him a microphone. All right, hearing no questions or no discussion, all those in favor of accepting this bylaw change, please say aye.
Aye.
Are there any opposed? All right, that motion carries. The next item on our agenda this morning comes also from committee. It does not need a second because it comes from committee. I'm going to invite Joe Henderson and Rod Fair up. They're going to share a little bit about some of the work that has been done by the South Property Task Force. And while they do that, we emailed out this last week in the Weekly News a summary. I have some hard copies of that in there, and so in the church I'm going to run in and grab those real quick, and if you would like to take a look at that, you can just wave your hand and I'll get one for you.
I trust you,
Morning.
Good morning.
My name is Joe Henderson. I took my mask off because I can't see because it fogs up my glasses. I don't know if anybody else has that problem. So we wanted to talk to you about the sale of the South property. Closer? Sorry. Okay. We wanted to talk to you about the sale of the South property. And so the session formed the South Property Task Force in 2018. And we had our first meeting on February 4th, 2018. And the members of the South property were myself and Steve Simcox and Betty Stevenson and Bill Alsdorf and Joan Root, Rod Fair, and Bill Wallace. We met 8 times during that time period. Some background on the South property. The church property is one large piece of property that's about 13 acres in size, and it goes all the way from Southern Street all the way down to Purcell. And if you look down to the south here, you can see this building down here, and obviously that's not on our property. And you can see some markers over to the side where they've marked their property. The south property is approximately 5.8 acres. And I took some time to stake off the south property a couple of weeks ago. And you can see stakes at the corners if you know where to look, but there's one down by the street down here. And I put these orange cones here to show you where the approximate limits of the south property are. And my measuring wheel is standing over here behind the tree. That's one corner, and then there's a red stake over there by the ditch. And so that's the limits that are closest to the church. And the south property is approximately, the closest point is approximately 105 feet from the edge of the parking lot. And so that would be this cone right here. The south property was purchased in 2000 with money that was donated by Penny Pennock, and the church received a letter notifying the church of the donation. And the only known written restriction that we're aware of is that the letter said this will become a protective buffer against the commercial development on 27th Avenue. It could also be used for expanded parking and future building expansion. Betty has stated in our meetings that it was Penny's desire to locate the Pennock Center on the church property so that the community would know that the Pennock Center is a ministry of the church. The Pennock Center board has elected to receive 10% of the net proceeds of the sales price rather than building a new building on the church property, and this has been approved by the session. When the gift was made, the church was in a different place with a much larger membership. It was a welcome gift. In light of our current financial dependence on Brighton Leadership Academy, repositioning this asset as a money-generating source would make it the best gift at this time. If the church sells the south property, a buffer that is a minimum of 5 feet would remain between the parking lot and the south property. Now I'll let Rod talk to you about the reasons to sell the property.
Good morning. My name's Rod Fair, and we've been meeting on this subject at the church and in quite some time, a couple of years now, and the committee has been diligent in research, and especially Joe. I want to thank Joe for working with the city and various other entities to understand what the property lines are, surveys, city requirements, codes, etc. So great job, Joe. The church does not and is not in a financial position to develop this property. That would have been terrific if we had enough cash flow to subdivide it and sell it commercially and make a lot of money off of it, or even keep the property and become, landlords. But none of that is feasible. The church could certainly use the money from the sale of the property to enable the church to continue to exist into the future. Currently, our church receives almost $60,000 a year in rent from the Brighton Leadership Academy and the Four Seasons Early Learning Center, the building over to the north. The Brighton Leadership Academy is a charter school, primarily Hispanic, and they had two grades, essentially, or two levels of education. One was a middle school sort of age group, and elementary, and the other was high school. The initial group that was here was that younger group, and sadly the state has not renewed their charter. So we were going to be without that $60,000, $50,000 rather, which would have put us in a real bind in terms of our budget. Fortunately, the high school aged group decided to rent that space, and they are going to move their high school away from where they were, quite some distance from here, into this space, but for who knows how long. So that $50,000 could be a year, it could be a few years, but their goal ultimately is to build a building and have their own school. So it will not likely be there forever. The church was able to sign a lease, as I mentioned, for the middle and high school grades for this year, and as I mentioned, without this rental income, the church simply would be in a crisis. Did you want to take back over here, Joe?
Sure.
Let me talk briefly about selling the property. We did discuss the sale of the property with 2 real estate brokers, and both the brokers recommended that the church allow multifamily housing to be constructed on the property. They provided estimates of what the property would sell for if it was zoned, or if we allowed commercial development like office space, which office space isn't very popular these days. Since everybody's working from home, and I think that's going to continue for a while because I think people like working from home. But the estimated sales price for the property, if it was, if commercial office was built there, would be about $150,000. However, if the church allowed multifamily dwelling units on there, apartments or condos, something like that, the sales price could be in excess of $1.5 million. I mentioned that this orange cone right here is the north edge of that property line. The city in their zoning ordinances has setbacks, and depending on what's built there wouldn't be any buildings within 15 or 25 feet of this line. So there wouldn't be any buildings right up to this line. Regarding the sale, if the church decides to move forward with it, we decide how to market the property. And then once we start receiving offers, the church can elect whether to take the offer or not, depending on what the buyer wants to do with the property. So it's not we're never forced to sell it if we don't get an offer that we like. And that concludes our presentation, and I guess we'd open it up to questions.
So I just want to clarify real quick the process that is involved here. Obviously, the South Property Task Force has been working for quite some time on this, nearly 3 years. The process in the Presbyterian Church is this. In order for the property of a church to be sold, the session must first approve that sale, which the session has done. The session then calls a congregational meeting, and the congregation must approve the sale of that property, which is what we are doing now. After this, then the sale of this property, before we can move forward with that, we will have to talk to the presbytery, because the presbytery also has to approve the sale of this property. So the process that we are in is one that has kind of been set out before us, and so that's why we find ourselves doing this, because in order to sell this property, it's not just up to the session, it's not even just up to the congregation. There are a number of groups of people that have to approve this, and so I would like, again, this comes from committee, and so it does not need a second, but I would like to open the floor if there are questions or concerns or comments. There is a microphone up here that you can use, and so if there are any questions, please come forward now.
My question is, what's going to happen to this tree?
It's still on our property, so we still get to decide what happens with this tree.
It's in God's hands.
That's right.
It's in God's hands.
It's in God's hands.
Good morning. Thank you to the committee for doing so much work on the back end. I think I was unaware of a lot of the work that's been going on behalf of the church. And so I thank you guys for all the time and thoughtfulness that you put into this. One of my questions is, I grew up next door to Penny, and I know this gift was for the church and ultimately with the ministry of care in mind. And I guess it's a little bit for the committee. Did we at all explore if this, if we could potentially sell the property, but with something that's more for the community, as maybe not a direct ministry that we provide, but something that still does good for the community? And I don't even know what that would be, whether a food bank or I have no idea. But if it would be something that would still be in the spirit of what Penny had intended, but still accomplishes us making something for the operations of the church to continue what we do.
So as I mentioned, it'll be up to the church to decide, or I guess ultimately up to the session, once we get an offer, whether we accept it or not, depending on what the buyer wants to do with the property. So it could be something community-minded like that too.
In answer to that question also, I'd like to let everybody know that at least on some level, one of the things that Penny thought might be able to be done with this property is that the Pennock Center might be able to build a building here that they could use. That at this point is not feasible, and the Pennock board has kind of had those conversations. The session, although none of the money has been earmarked at this point, the session has agreed and voted that 10% of the sale of this property, which is probably more than the Pennock Center building would have been, it will be given to the Pennock Center and that endowment. So at least a tithe of that will be given to the Pennock Center. What the land gets used for, we don't know yet, but at least some of the proceeds of that money are going to be to that effect.
I have two questions. You mentioned multi-family units. Are you talking like high rises or like some of them in town? I mean, not that they're 10 stories, but some of the buildings that are multi-family are quite high, or more like these over here that are just basically 1 or 2 stories high. Or do we have any control over what's built there? And secondly, I guess Chris has sort of answered it, like what's going to happen with the money? Is that earmarked? Or is that still to be determined?
Well, the church would have the ability to decide whether it wanted to accept an offer. And so if somebody came in here and wanted to build high rises, I don't think the church would accept that offer. And there's no buildings like that in Brighton, or even in Adams County, so I don't think that.
Well, there's some that are 4 or 5 stories high.
True.
There's some that are higher than that, over by Safeway, or
Huh.
Over by the prison probably.
I guess I need to get out more. But it'll be up to the church to decide whether they want to accept the offer. And as far as the money goes, like Chris mentioned, 10% of the net sales price will go to the Pennock Center to help with their ministry. And then it'll be up to the session to decide what the rest of that money is used for. But my thought would be that we put it into an endowment and work with the proceeds so that we have that money into perpetuity. And so in reality, Penny's gift would be a gift that lasts forever if we do it that way.
One of the things that I'm going to simplify this, and I'm sorry if it feels like it's pedantic, but if we had a car for sale and we said you can drive that car anywhere you want except for Nebraska, do you think you're going to get the same price for the car not being able to drive through Nebraska or with no encumbrance whatsoever? So think about it.
Yeah, my question is, will the 10% for the Pennock Center, is that going to be part of the endowment, the church's endowment, or is that going to be given directly to them for them to use it as they please?
Other than the 10% tithe that would go to the Pennock Center, the session has not determined what the proceeds would be used for. If that were to come at this time, and me being on session, I would certainly encourage that we do not use that for cash flow purposes. That would certainly be something that I would encourage that go into trust in some form.
The 10%, yeah, right, as of right now, well, the plan is for that 10% to go to the endowment specifically. That endowment right now has hit some some troubled waters, and so it will help to increase that endowment back. Bill's on that committee, so he can speak to it a little bit.
Basically saying the same thing, that the intent from the Pennock board would be that the money would go into the endowment to rebuild the endowment.
Are there any other questions? Go ahead, Adam.
Sorry, I've just been thinking about this a lot, having grown up in the church and grown up next to Penny, and it's been on my mind a lot. If the church were to vote yes to approve this today, does then the decisions go out of the hands of the congregation and it's in the sessions regarding like what's approved to be built there and so on, or does it again come back to the congregation to decide what we approve?
The decision on the approval would lie with the session.
So in other words, it's if we as a congregation vote yes, then it sort of is, that's it as far as what we would approve on the property, and it's in the session's hands?
Yeah, per the book of order, I think that it would be in the session's hands. That does not preclude the session from talking to the congregation or for the congregation for sharing their input, right? I mean, the session is a body that is called to discern together the direction that God is leading the church. And part of that is being a part of the community and listening to the community and hearing what's going on in the community. So although the decision is specifically the sessions, a big part of that decision-making process is being in conversation with all of you.
My question is, what's this going to look like? The beauty that we see, the front range, some space around our church. I mean, I'm thinking in my mind, a 10-foot brick wall right along this line here. What's that going to look like? What's that money going to do? Penny gave this property and gave that money to the church to do something with it, and we haven't done what she asked. And then she's only getting 10% back to what she gave 100% to the church. The endowments. I'm glad we're not going to use this money just to put in our pockets, because we're getting into an unsustainable point. That money is disappearing. So I'm glad it's going into an endowment, but as we've seen in the Pennock Center, even the endowments aren't safe. If our economy keeps growing, yeah, we can do well. But if our economy's not doing well, that money's just going to disappear. We have some beauty here. I'm thinking we need to either keep the land, or if we do sell it, I'd like to see, the Brighton Leadership Academy build their place on that property. At least the community gets something out of it. But just to sell it off, we lose control. There's no control of what's going to happen. Like Joe said, whoever buys it, they're going to have their way with it. we lose all control. The only control we have is right now. We can either sell a property and have whatever 3-story buildings or brick walls or whatever they decide to put on their property because it's theirs, or we can retain control of it. So think wisely. We need to do as a church what's responsible, not just put off what's inevitable. We need to control our future. Selling the property, that's a decision right now for us to make. But I think we're giving up a lot more by selling it than we're going to be gaining. It's your choice.
Thank you, Oleg.
I just wanted to respond to what Oleg said, and the church will have the ability to decide what it wants to accept as far as the use goes. If we don't like the use that this potential buyer wants to use the property for, we don't have to sell it to them. And I say we because it's us. And so if they want to come and build tall buildings, we don't have to sell it to them. And as far as putting the money in the endowment, General Endowment 1 and General Endowment 2 are in great shape, and the church relies on that income to sustain itself right now. And I think that if you read the summary that was sent out with the e-blast, Brighton Leadership Academy contributes more than $50,000 to our bottom line every year. And we almost lost them in May. We were able to get them to sign a contract. But if we hadn't had them, if they didn't come back to us, there would have been a $50,000 hole in our budget. And the session would have had to make some pretty tough decisions on where does that money come from. And like I mentioned, if we put that money into an endowment, it's going to be there forever. So Penny's gift will last forever. So I think the church needs this money to sustain its ministry. And that's why I've invested as much time as I have in this.
Being somewhat familiar with city codes, I don't think you can build a 10-foot fence. I think the height limitation on code in Brighton is something like 7 feet or something. 6, 7 feet.
I guess my question is, what kind of checks and balances are there in the offers for the committee to decide whether they want to accept an offer? And are those checks and balances permanently in place, or can the buyer change their mind and go from one type of structure to a different type of structure?
That's a really good question. So the sale of the property won't be finalized until the city approves the use. And so let's say the buyer proposes to develop it in a particular manner that the church thinks is okay. And so we enter into a contract to go that direction. And if the buyer changes its mind and decides that that person or that company wants to do something different, the church can rescind that offer. You know, we can cancel the contract. But the sale won't be complete until the city has approved the zoning and the use. So even if we put up a for sale sign next week, which let's say in a few months we put up a for sale sign, it might be several years down the road before we actually see the money.
Well, I wasn't going to speak because I'm on the task force committee as well as on the PennOC board. And so I'm really torn between these two in some respects. But I think it's important to have people that haven't been around to have a little bit of history, and those of you that have been here for 16 years or more maybe remember that 16 years ago there was a long-range planning committee that discussed this whole thing about selling the land. And at that time they used some of the Mach 1 money, about $60,000, to replat this in hopes that they could sell it and make a real nice area over there. Well, in the information that I have, it was very clear that when the attorneys looked over the stuff, that they said, but keep in mind, even though there's not money now for a PennOC center, that should be in the back of everyone's mind that that's one of the big wishes that Penny had for this land. So that said, I know that it's important to have more revenue coming in for the church, and I know the PennOC Center has been in a situation right now with the endowment funds being up and down so much, but I do think that we need to keep thinking about what would Penny do in this situation. She was a smart woman. She had a huge heart, a great mind, and I think that we need to make a decision that would make Penny smile. I don't know what that is, but I hear all these conversations, and I think that she's trying to guide us in a way that we can make a good decision so that this property can be something special still for Penny. Yes.
Didn't your board discuss this and decide that they didn't have the wherewithal to do something over here and made a choice?
So Rod just asked whether or not the PennOC board discussed the possibility of building a building here for the PennOC Center, and kind of agreed that they did not have the wherewithal to make that happen. Is that true?
That is true. And at that time, when we were discussing this, another idea that had come up is on the original replotting of this, there were 5 lots, and they said, well, we could reserve one of the 5 lots for the PennOC Center if things ever turned around. And so, in my mind, 5 lots, if we had one of it, that would be 20%. So if we couldn't have money to build on that, we could use that 20% to go back into the endowment and bring it back up to the original amount. But then things changed because of square footage, so I guess it's 10% now, but you're right. And even 16 years ago, it was stated in some of the information that we got from the attorneys that at this time it's not possible to build a building with money coming just from the interest being paid on the endowment.
Are there any other questions or comments? Oh, yes. Sorry, you were hiding behind that big old tree there.
My question is, and maybe picking back up a little bit off of that, is it an option for part of the 5 acres to potentially be sold, and that would still allow some additional cash flow to come in, but still would reserve, 2 or whatever acres that we potentially could do something community focused with that land?
Yeah, the committee has had these discussions, and we've also had discussions about 5, 10-story high-rises, and there's no interest in that whatsoever. the discussions that the Pennock Center had were that they didn't want to reserve the land now, and they voted to accept part of the funds to help restore the trust. So we take them at their word, and that was their wishes, and that's where we ended up where we're at. If we keep the land and just sit on it, they have nothing to help them out of their current distress.
Would it be a half and half where we sell 2.5 acres worth of land that would help the Pennock Center in their troubles, and then we would still own another 2.5 of that property for potential future use that would maybe honor the.
Well, in essence, what you're suggesting is that 100% of the proceeds go to the Pennock Center in one form or another.
No, instead of a 5+ acre lot being sold, 2.5 acres is sold. Pennock still would get their 10% of that sale, and then the church would still own. So, still a sale of a property, just not as large of a property.
Just not sell all of the property.
Okay. I don't think Pennock Center would need 2.5 acres to build a building.
Pennock Center. We would sell still to a buyer the same way that we are.
The unsold portion would be far more land than the Pennock Center would need. 2.5 acres would be too big for them.
But I think what she's indicating is that it's not about, she's more interested in, kind of to Oleg's point, how do we preserve some of this land? Not so much the amount that goes to the Pennock Center or those things. Is it possible to sell half the land and then keep half of the land as you know, as a buffer, as a green space, as open space? I think that's the question at hand.
Anything is possible.
Right, and that is, so as a point of order, what we have in front of us, the discussion that we have is a discussion of selling all of the 5 acres and using the proceeds and giving 10% to the Pennock Center as the session has approved. In order for us to change the motion, we would have to have a counter motion and a second in order to change that, and to change the motion to selling just half of the land. And so that would, and then I might need my resident book of order expert. Is that something that the session has to approve first and then the congregation, or is the congregation, if the congregation makes that motion now? Yes, I believe that's live as well.
Well, the decision of the session was based on the decision of the Pennock board. So I think that if people are feeling uncomfortable, we're not honoring, if we do something different, that we amend the motion, then are we honoring the Pennock board's decision? So that's one thing to ask.
I think the question is, if the motion gets amended, and the congregation says we'd rather sell 2.5 acres rather than all 5, do we then have to? Does the session have to approve that? We have to call another congregational meeting, or the session approves that after the congregation, or how does that work?
No, I think if the session has, if you follow Roberts is one answer and the order would be another. So Roberts would say that a recommendation coming from session could be modified by the congregation and approved. Book of order, however, I don't have it with me, and I don't have every page memorized. I would have to go back and look.
I don't believe you.
It does begin with the progress of the session making a recommendation and the congregation voting it up or down.
So I think per the book of order, we have to vote this up or down. And if the congregation decides to vote no, then we could be referred back to the session to do further work on it.
Yeah, it could go back to the session or the task force.
Okay.
I would like a clarification, exactly what land is being reserved if you sell the 5 acres. I wasn't clear. Can you point it out again, Joe? It seemed like there was a fair amount being left, but I could be wrong.
The property that would remain with the church is essentially down to this orange cone right here, and it's a line that goes to the street.
Perpendicular to the street.
Perpendicular to the street. And then over here is my measuring wheel, and that's Chris is standing by my measuring
right here.
wheel. And that's one corner of the 5 acres, 5.8 acres. And then you can see a stake over there by the ditch, and that's the other corner of the 5.8 acres. It is. Yeah, we'd have everything north of that line.
There is a map in the summary if you would like, if anybody has further questions and would like to take a look at that. I do have more summaries up here if somebody needs one, but so there is a map in that summary.
How many acres is that? How many acres are we reserving?
Well,
It's 13 minus 5, 6, so about 7 acres.
we would have 7 acres left.
But I mean,
Including the land that's paved and has a building on it.
it seems to me like that's quite a bit of land. I mean, not counting what we already have built on. It would be enough room to build another building if needed, or to do something with. It seems to me like you could build another building or more parking lots, or if you wanted to do a community something, you still have room for that, it seems to me, on this side of the parking lot, like over there or something. I don't think that precludes doing something else with it. I mean, it's just weeds now.
It is.
I am speaking to what, people like Adam has said, his concern, he wants to do something with the community or whatever, or even Panic Center, if they wanted to build a building down the road, there's room for a building there, I think, depending on how big a building they wanted. I don't think we're ruling out all of those things in the future if we really needed that or wanted that. That's my opinion, but maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. How much room would they need, but...
I have a question for the committee. I feel like, I know you have been working for years now, and I appreciate your work very much. I just feel like most of us are just kind of new to the party and just haven't really thought about it a lot or considered a lot of the options. And so I'm just curious, what other, as you were visioning or thinking about, wow, what are the things we could do with that 5 acres? Could you share with us some of the things that maybe you dreamed about or envisioned, and why you decided that none of those were feasible and we should probably just sell it? That's in our best interests.
Wasn't there a survey done of the congregation?
Yeah. So I really like Merrill's point. I mean, I hadn't thought about it, but I mentioned earlier that the city would require a setback of 15 to 25 feet depending on what's built, and so with 105 feet minimum, there is room to build a building out here. I hadn't even thought of that. So I guess, Bonnie, way back when we had the long-range planning committee that Joan mentioned, we did look at how we could develop that property, but at that time we determined we didn't have the money to do it, and that hasn't changed. And so really the the task force was looking at how can we best set the church up for longevity and satisfy Penny's wishes the best we can.
Sorry, so you didn't consider any, because I know at one point there was talk of like a youth center or something like that on our property. So you didn't consider any specific ideas or dreams? I'm just curious about that part.
There was a, way back, I think 2004 era, time period, there was a survey done that looked at those kind of things, but there just wasn't the money to do that, and there still isn't. And we're at a point where if Brighton Leadership Academy pulls out in May, the session has to make some choices, really hard choices.
Yeah, all of those things were discussed in committee. All of those things. Open space, a building for the Pennock Center, an auditorium kind of thing for public music presentations and whatnot, a park. All of those things were discussed. Development of apartments, development of commercial, all of those discussions were had. Yes, they were. And we got no money, and we can't develop it without money. And if you have, and the city was not interested in buying it for a park and keeping it as open space, and if you keep it as something like a auditorium kind of outdoor concert space, the number of times that you would use that throughout the year would be small. Half the year it would be too cold, which drives the price down to that they would want it for nothing. So all of these things were discussed, yeah. And we felt that the sale of the land with minor encumbrances, such as building height restrictions, would give us the best income in terms of going forward. Doesn't have to be the whole site, but that would be sort of what we worked out, I think, in discussions with Pennock. They were on board with not building a building and taking that. So we felt this would give them the biggest bang for their buck as well in a time where they need it. And so anything you do to reduce the amount of land reduces the amount that would go to the Pennock Center, which, that's for them to decide. But we felt this would be the best thing to do. There were lots of discussions about those kind of uses.
My question is in reference to what Merrill had about, could we build something back into maybe that far northeast corner, somewhere around here, is I think we would probably need to check with the city on the zoning allowable to do that, even though that is our property. There may be some stipulations of what we can do or not do as it was originally planned. So my other question is in reference to where we had the thing that we voted earlier for the remote voting. There's quite a few families that don't come to the services here for various reasons, that elderly, whatever like that I don't think they're being included in the voting process. And there's enough questions that have been raised here today to figure out what are we looking at, and there's more questions to be answered, and that maybe we need to take and step back a little bit. I know we've been working on this for some time, but just to see, can we get a little bit more input from some of these other people that are not being allowed to vote on this today. So I guess back to Joe, or what you've done within the zoning, is it possible even to build on some of our vacant land back toward this area on this northeast side?
I think we'd have to ask the city that question to be sure. I mean, I don't think they would preclude us from building another church building, a building owned by the church, but, you know, we have to ask that to be sure. But with the setbacks that the city has, we could build a pretty decent sized building in one of these corners of the property.
I want to speak a little bit, John, to your concern about whether or not people who haven't been able to be in worship are have been able to be a part of this this process. And so, a couple of things we have. I have had conversations with a number of people who couldn't be here today and knew they weren't going to be here today, and I asked those who knew they weren't going to be here if they would be willing to communicate with me. And there were some of the questions I've heard this morning were questions that they had. As I answered those questions and tried to have conversations with them, everybody that I spoke to in the last week, now granted it wasn't a lot of people, I think it was 3 households of people that I spoke to after having their questions answered. And I'm not trying to sway anybody's vote, but everybody that I spoke to, I'll just say this: they felt like their questions were heard, and then in responses to me, without me asking for them to vote, all voted in the affirmative. And so a lot of the questions that are being asked here have been asked by other people, people who aren't here, and those questions have been addressed in a manner that made them comfortable with the potential sale of the land. Granted, there may be people who didn't reach out to me, to your point.
One of the things about building a building, and I presume by a building you're meaning another Pennock Center building here, is that what you're thinking? We did discuss that, and one of the concerns that people who are getting counseling have is they don't want to be seen walking out of the counseling building by their fellow parishioners. And that's why the site off campus is helpful, because they have privacy. If we were to build it, the committee discussed putting it over in this far southeast corner so that you could access the building from Purcell Street and not be observed by people coming out of the church. It's sensitive. People don't necessarily want to be seen as needing counseling, having counseling, getting counseling. And so I think that would be a reason not to put the counseling center right there, because I just think it's within eyeshot.
Although I would say I'd rather see us change the stigma about counseling.
That's going to take a while.
That's probably more than we have the ability to do, but I do think that's probably a bigger problem. Cheryl, did you have something you want to share? You can use that microphone if you'd like.
I do. If it was Penny's wish to have this be part of the Pennock Center, why are we only going to give them 10% of the proceeds and not more?
The Pennock Center was asked what kind of a building they would build on that property, and they wanted to build a 5,000 square foot building. And in researching city codes, that would have required a lot that was roughly 8% of the total acreage of the south property. And the session thought that 10% was a better number because it was more like a tithe. I wasn't in the session meeting, that's just what I've heard. But 8% was what Pennock Center would need to build that building.
All right, if there are no further questions or comments, I'd like to ask that we now vote on the sale of this south property. So all those who are in favor of selling the south property, please say aye. Aye. And all those opposed, please say nay.
How are you going to do that?
How do we
You're
stand?
either going to have to stand or something, or we're going to have to,
Okay.
or we're going to have a ballot vote, but we're not ready for that.
Ballot.
I would like to propose, in light of the fact that this vote is as close as it is, that, and in light of the fact that we can now do electronic voting, that the session go back to the drawing board and consider some of the questions that have been raised this morning, and that we call another congregational meeting at a later date to have another vote. I know that means a little bit more work for the session, but I also think that in this time of pandemic, when things for a lot of us are uneasy and uncertain, that a little bit more time to think and consider and recognize the diversity of opinions here is not a bad thing. And so at this point, rather than calling for another vote where we ask people to stand and we split hairs and maybe we end up, 55-45 or whatever, I'm going to ask that we not clarify that vote this morning, and that we get that the session reconvene to further discuss the questions that have been raised this morning. And so I believe that's within my rights as a moderator. and so that's what I'm going to have us do. And so at this point, we have no further business. Could I get a motion to adjourn our meeting? And a second? All right, that's been moved in second. All those in favor, please stand and join me in prayer. Or if you can't stand, feel free to sit. Let's pray. God, we are grateful that we can come together in this kind of setting and discuss and discern and do so civilly and recognizing deep feelings on all sides. God, we want, at the end of the day, what we want is to make sure that we are taking care of each other and loving each other, and that we are being faithful to the work that you've called us to. And so, God, we lift this decision up to you. We lift up the work that is yet to be done, and we ask that you would help us to do it faithfully. We ask that you would help all of us to better to discern how we can most faithfully serve you and take care of and love one another. We pray all of these things in your name. Amen. All right. Thanks, everybody. I appreciate your time this morning.